Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today I get to sit down and have a conversation with somebody I've respected for such a long time who's doing such innovative and great work for the church, for Christians who are really trying to engage the cultural conversation, and it's John Mark Comer. Now, John is a pastor out in Portland, Oregon, one of my favorite cities, let's just say, a place that's just beautiful, but just full of so many creative people, so much imagination, so many churches who are really pioneering what it looks like to answer the questions that so many people have on their minds today, but sometimes aren't in context where they feel free to ask them. Well, in Portland, Oregon, people don't mind asking them. And it's much like when our family lived in New York City and the experience of knowing that you're truly a counterculture, you're truly in the minority as a Christian who wants to walk that out, talk about it, have conversations about God and faith with people. There's an openness to it in these kinds of contexts because people generally are open to anybody. They're pretty well formed in how they think about life. They're happy for you to have your way to think about it. And it creates these awesome conversations. And so John Mark Comer, his history has been living in that context and trying to really translate what does it look like to take a lot of these ideas, Christian ideas, deep truths that we just assume many times in Christian context. But when you get into the real world of conversations with skeptics and cynics and those who've had really bad experiences, maybe many wounds with God and their pursuit of life and their own experience, you really can't just give these packaged answers. They just don't work. And so what I love about John is he really pushes into that. That's been his story. That's been his history. And so at Q, it's so important for us to engage these kinds of conversations. So much of our work at Q is to help equip Christians, people who many times are in leadership positions or you're in your community or in your industry. You're really trying to sort through how do I have real conversations with people about faith in a time where there's a lot of skepticism and sort of an anti-religion bias that creeps up no matter what your religion might be. And yet we also know people are spiritual, they're open, they are wanting something more transcendent. They're realizing that the answers that they've just been given all along or that others talk about just aren't working. And their lives are sort of in these messes of confusion and there's a lot of contradiction and they're looking for clarity. Well, I think John helps us get some of that clarity. In our conversation today, you're going to hear somebody who's absolutely confident, somebody, though, who also understands how much we have to really have compassion for those who we're trying to speak to. But in addition to this isn't only a conversation about the person outside the church and what does it look like to talk to them about some of these really important, difficult conversations. It probably in many ways is for you and me, those who are inside the church, maybe who've been Christians for a long time, maybe who've heard some of these languages we use. You know, people call it Christianese, like our relationship with God and all those kinds of things that we've just grown so comfortable talking about. And yet not always do we even understand what we're talking about. And sometimes we just get caught up again in the routines and in going through the motions, playing the game, so to speak. And we don't pause long enough to consider, what is my relationship with God look like? What is that based on? Where do we even get that language? And who is it that God says He is? And so John's been working hard on a project over the last couple of years that's releasing now called God Has a Name. And he really takes us into, and I'm going to let him do this, but into Exodus, where he kind of roots this understanding of our relationship with God and what does that look like? And why is it that sometimes we're feeling it, sometimes we're not feeling it? How do we think about these things? And so it's going to be a great spiritual kind of exploration for all of us to just hear and listen to a pastor who pastors those outside the church and many inside the church to just better understand how should we be thinking about God in an era where people are questioning whether we can trust Him, whether there is a God, or whether those who are people of faith even have anything good to offer to the world. So let's listen in to the conversation I just had with John Mark Comer. Well, John Mark, it's great to have you on the Q Podcast. And I think for some people listening, they don't know you. They haven't really heard much of your story. So we're going to try to, in the next several minutes, help people catch up a little bit just on where you've come from, like why you ended up being in the middle of Portland with a church, like just how that journey happened. And then I want to jump into some really provocative and great things that you've been writing and contributing that have challenged me and I think have been a great challenge to the church. But first, welcome and give us a little Reader's Digest version of just your journey to being a pastor right now.
Yeah, I'm in Portland, Oregon. I live right in the urban core. So if you've ever been to Portland, Powell's Books is kind of like this landmark, largest independent bookstore in the world. I live right by there, pastor a church right around the corner from there. And I'm a father, 3 kids. And I guess my life is built around this idea of really a question: how do we practice the way of Jesus in the kind of emerging urban, secular, progressive, post-Christian world, which is not all of America, but it is very much a Portland or San Francisco or an LA or parts of Nashville or New York, and more due to the digital age and Wi-Fi and the smartphone, it's everywhere. Yeah. And I guess I'm really asking the question, how do we not only survive kind of this new cultural moment, but how do we thrive as a follower of Jesus, as a father with a family? How do I raise children in this kind of an environment? My kids are all in public school and all that comes with it. And how do I lead a church? There's so many fascinating things about our cultural moments. So I guess that's really the question that I'm asking. And we planted about 7 years ago. So to your, I guess, other question about how I got into it, I'm not really sure. And that's a long, convoluted, who knows. My dad actually is and was a pastor. So I grew up kind of interesting for me. I grew up in the megachurch thing, like before it was the norm. So my dad was on staff at a church in the Bay Area of California, which is where I grew up in the 1970s. Back when I read recently, there were only 10 churches in the entire country, over 2,000 people. So I think that was kind of the world I grew up in, was kind of the mega, the evangelicals and non-denominational Bible church, kind of straight down the middle theology. Kind of that was the world, West Coast, that was the world I grew up in. And I think there's a lot about that world that I still carry with me, but a lot that just doesn't work right now. And so I think I've really just been exploring the question, all right, what does the future of the church look like? How do we stay true to all that was good and beautiful and true about that model and that time and that generation, but yet adapt what we need to for our cultural moment?
Well, and that's so much of what we care about at Q, is helping leaders, not only pastors, but leaders in business and education, politics, media and entertainment, understand how do we really see what God's doing in our moment, because, hey, we're here. This is where God placed us for a really great reason, and to be creative about what is he trying to do. How do we be faithful? Part of your journey 7 years ago mirrors my journey. I left Atlanta, moved to New York City with our mutual friend John Tyson, and was able to be part of a couple of church plants, very much motivated as you're describing. I want to be in a post-Christian setting where the stuff we're talking about really has to have flesh on it. Like, it can't just be ideologies. We've got to be walking it out. And you and John, and I know Rick McKinley's a good friend of yours there in Portland, and Chris C. There's so many people in these urban centers leading and thinking the way you're thinking. And what I was always blown away by, John Mark, and I wonder if you'd comment on this, is in Manhattan, the churches that were practicing a faithfulness to Orthodox Christianity, just being faithful to the gospel, like you said, right down the center kind of theology, biblical theology, had young people showing up in droves, and they were interested in this kind of a church. Whereas it was a bit counterintuitive, because you would think they'd be more interested in something that feels just a little more liberal, maybe people who are kind of going with the trends of how the faith should show up in spirituality in a city like that. And yet we saw the opposite. We saw people craving something that had more rootedness. Do you see that in your church in Portland? Is that something you've experienced yourself?
Absolutely. And not only in Portland, every single place I go in the world, I find that to be true. Portland people think of as this, hyper-secular kind of graveyard for church plants. Actually, there are more healthy, thriving, great churches in the urban core of Portland than any other city that I know of. So I could count churches that if my church were to blow up or die or fall apart, I would go to in a heartbeat and raise my family in a heartbeat, right in the center of one of the most progressive cities in America, if not in the world. And I see it all over. A key book for me, actually, that's not very fun to read at all. It's a dry academic read, but was this little book barely anybody knows about called The Churching of America by Rodney Stark. I'm not sure Starts a historian out of Baylor. Yeah, and he's kind of really well known for his book, The Rise of Christianity, and he has some great books on church history. And he has this beautiful kind of chronicle of the American church story. And he basically, and it's really interesting because if I understand correctly, he is a liberal, progressive kind of version of Christian. But he basically makes the argument that liberal churches die, that there is absolutely no future for the liberal church. It's only once a church goes liberal, it essentially signs, and that word has all sorts of different meanings, all sorts of different people. So show me a little grace with what that word means. But basically, in particular at a theological level, when a church goes liberal or goes progressive, it basically signs its death warrant. It's only a matter of time. And he makes that point from basically the last 300 to 400 years of Western European history, and in particular from American history. And it's exactly what I see. I just don't think in our cultural moment, you notice people, and I watch this a lot because a lot of the friends that I grew up with that were smart, kind of thoughtful people have drifted to the progressive end of things and have either left the faith or for sure have at least left the church. And that's a really interesting thing to me. I see very, very few people move to a progressive vision at a theological or even a social level and stay rooted in a local community. And I think that's just because it's so against the flow of our culture, against the individualism, against the consumerism, materialism, to actually embed yourself with the same group of ordinary, normal people with problems and issues and do life around a table every week together, practicing the way of Jesus. Again, I think that's so countercultural, whether you're progressive or conservative in your take on Jesus, that I think unless if you have a really robust faith in what this is, it just doesn't make it in our moment.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I'm so glad our Q listeners are hearing this from a pastor, a church planner who's grown up in those environments that basically aren't the typical kind of Christian Southern spaces that I now live in the Nashville area, and so many others just have assumed much of America was like. And there's something about that press of living up against a culture and knowing that the truthfulness of what you say you believe is going to be tested every day. And you're going to be asked to live in a different way to where your neighbors are going, man, you guys are kind of weird. Like you're kind of odd. You're kind of, but I'm curious about it. I'm not pushed away by it. I'm really curious that you live your life in these rhythms. You care about the Sabbath. You come together around the table. You're hospitable. And yet you hold on to some of these ideas that I realize fly in the face of progressive contemporary culture. But you feel like you have a lot of life, like there's life where you're at. And that's what comes out, I think, in a lot of your writings. And I want our listeners who maybe haven't read some of your books to make this just a part of their library. So I'm really putting the hard sell on now because I want listeners to go get your books because so many of them they're beautiful in the way they're written. They're very accessible and so deep and rich theologically. So Loveology is one of those books. Give us just like a sentence on the thesis of Loveology, and then I want to go through another couple because I want people to really understand what's here.
Well, first off, you're very kind, and so thank you. I'm not sure half of that is true, but thank you. Loveology is basically just a biblical theology of love, marriage, sexuality in particular, and kind of male, female, gender, romantic relationships. And it's less of a relationship book and more of a theology book, or I prefer the word worldview book. And I really think that when you talk about sexuality, which is such an acute issue right now, you're really talking about worldview more than you're talking about morality or even relationship stuff. You're really talking about what story of reality do you believe to be true? What does it mean to be human? And your sexuality is a part of your humanity. So really, sexuality is about anthropology, which is about your worldview, what narrative script you live into to make sense of the world. So that's kind of what it's about.
Yeah, it's a great book. And then Garden City, which, by the way, I was speaking with somebody who a couple weeks ago, because Garden City's been out how long now?
I think a year and a half, a year and a half.
Yeah, and it was the Jubilee event in Pennsylvania. And I was reading the notes from somebody who just said, hey, the one book that these college students kept gravitating to, and it was this year. So it's not like it was because you just launched this book. It was a book that was sitting there that people loved that's called Garden City.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. So talk about Garden City. What's the thesis of that?
Yeah, I mean, similar. It's a worldview book as well, but a biblical theology is the kind of academic jargon for basically work. And of course, that is, once again, what it means to be human. I wrote it just because, like you, I share your passion for the intersection between faith and work, if you want to use that language. and this idea of what it means to be human, to be made in the image of God, to rule over the earth, how it's so much broader than just church work. And I am a pastor and a Bible teacher, so that's the role that I play in the common good. But I have a really robust, wide, hopefully deep theology of the role of politics and economics and education and art and urban planning and good coffee and everything in between. So it's about that. And part of that's because the church I lead is made up of about 65, 70% single people. Portland's the most overeducated city in America because unlike, which is an interesting factoid, unlike New York or San Francisco, where people kind of move there for a career, survive as long as they can, and then they move back home to Nashville or whatever, where they can actually afford to buy a house and raise a family or whatever. Portland people more move here for the lifestyle because it has this kind of Scandinavian, food, art, urban planning, nature, bicycle everywhere kind of thing. And then they find a job along the way. So you have all sorts of educated 20 and 30 somethings who are still single in a progressive city that are all trying to figure out what the heck to do with their life. And that's a lot of the church that I'm pastoring. And so I wrote it, I think, in a sense, just to give people a framework for work and discipleship and how those two things go together. And then also to couple it with this idea of Sabbath, because most of the good material I hear out there on work says little or nothing about rest. And I think those are two sides of the same coin. And you have to have those conversations simultaneously to get a healthy view of either.
Yeah, it's so good. And your most recent book, which I want to spend a few minutes on because it just released, and again is another one of those books that I think helps challenge people to just take a different angle, different perspective in thinking about their life, to their relationship with God and how they view God in general and their faith and how they're even living this stuff out. But it's called God Has a Name. Talk to us about the idea behind God Has a Name. What really, at this stage and season of you as a writer, why did you feel this was the topic that you needed to take on?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. One is just, I opened the book with that quote from A.W. Tozer, which those of you listening may or may not know was a well-known kind of writer and teacher in the middle of the last century. And he has this great line about how what comes to mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And then he goes on to say, because if what you think about God will basically shape your destiny in life. And I think what he's getting at is a key idea that you see in the Christian tradition and outside of it, that you become like what you worship. So I quote that, famous David Foster Wallace quote at the end of that commencement address he did, and I won't quote it here, but where he essentially says that everybody worships. Christians worship, Jews worship, atheists worship, agnostics worship. We, as human beings, were made to give our life over to some kind of meaning and purpose that is greater than ourselves. And if you want to call that worship, that's great. And I think what you worship, what you orient your life around, which in our tradition we call God and personify in God's reality, I think that will really shape your destiny, your trajectory in life, who you do or do not become. And where I think the rubber really meets the road is what you think about God is a great predictor of your long-term character and life autobiography. So if you think of God as angry and homophobic and mad at the world, then that will shape you into that kind of a person. If you think of God as a good kind of chill progressive who's all about tolerance and equality and nothing else, then that will shape you into that kind of person, for better or for worse. If you think of God as a prosperity gospel kind of there to make you healthy and wealthy, that will shape you into that. We become like our mental image of God, for better or for worse. The problem is that a lot of what we think about God says more about ourselves than it does about God. And a lot of it isn't rooted in the library of Scripture or in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. It's rooted in this kind of mishmash of pop theology and tweet soundbite and a sermon we heard here that might have been great or might have not have been great, and some perception of who Jesus is. So I think I really wanted to just lay out, like, who does God say that God is through the Scriptures and through the life, of course, of Jesus. But then I think at a bigger level, I think similar to you, I'm discouraged by the polarization that I see in our country between the right and the left, which is a uniquely American issue. It's not even as European or as global. And of course, we usually think about that at a political level between the left and the right, between Republican and Democrat. But it's far deeper than that. It happens at a socioeconomic level, the divide, and it happens at a theological level. And so I think what that looks like in the church is often, particularly young people that are growing up like myself in the church and look out at the kind of topography and landscape of the American church, you kind of feel like you have two options. And one is to go progressive and basically abandon a historic Orthodox view of Scripture and a number of the moral kind of ideas that come with Scripture and the teachings of Jesus and the writings of the New Testament to kind of update everything for the late modern West. And then the other option is you kind of live in this backlash of hyper-conservative, fundamentalist, systematic, kind of angry, whatever. And I just think there's got to be an option C that isn't so much even a middle ground as much as it is like a third option. So I kind of say this book is like if A.W. Tozer was The Knowledge of the Holy and Rob Bell's what we talk about when we talk about God had a love child and then she rebelled against her parents. That's kind of what it is. You may or may not get that if you're listening.
Yeah, for those of you who didn't get that, rewind, listen to it slowly. That was good.
That was it. And I think it's because I'm beating up, on one hand, the kind of Portland-esque progressive recasting of God to make him fit with the leftist vision. And at the same time, I'm beating up on the kind of hyper-conservative, and by conservative, I mean like the hyper kind of fundamentalist, God is a doctrine in a box, all systematic theology. Everything that happens is God is in control of this kind of angry comeback. And I think there is a third option that is far more compelling.
Yeah. When you present that in a place like Portland or just amongst your peers, do you find you get a lot of pushback when you talk so clearly and it's pretty cut and dry about these different sort of poles that really aren't that helpful for the future of the church? Do you feel a lot of pushback or do you more see enthusiasm around that?
I can't figure out why, but I honestly don't get a ton of pushback, which is bizarre to me. And I can't quite figure it out.
Okay, so pause there because it's really interesting. I was in an interview 2 weeks ago after Q, our conference, and the journalist was asking me a similar thing. She says, look, you've been really strong on this idea of sexuality, like you're really clear and how you're talking about identity, gender, transgender, like all these really difficult topics. Yeah. And you must just get littered with just hate mail and people coming after you. And I said, actually, no, I don't. I actually think a lot of that's a straw man. A lot of that's made up. I think people actually, there's nothing to be afraid of here. We're speaking truth and people feel it. They resonate with it. They're drawn to it. And in fact, people are drawing courage from it. I'm seeing more momentum around confidence. And while it might seem victim mentality to say, yeah, man, it's just been hard. I've been really lit up by criticism. It's like, actually, that's not true. That's not happening a lot. And I think it's important for people to hear that because so many people feel like they're lacking, I think, voice to speak to the things they believe because they're so worried about the pushback. And to hear you say, hey, I'm not getting that a ton, and I know I don't get that a ton, like, it's good.
Yeah, and that's really true. I think part of it is exactly what you said, it's true. The other part is, I think what you do really well, Gabe, and Q as a whole, and what we're trying to do here, and the other names you mentioned, Tyson, others like that, are we all work really hard to talk about the why before we talk about the what, if that language makes sense. And I think, in particular, sexuality is a great example. I think one of the mistakes the church made is it would talk a lot about, like, the what, in particular, the moral aspect of sexuality, like it's between a man and a woman, not a man and a man, and it's in marriage, marriage only, and so on and so forth. And it's not even that what the church said was wrong, but it's that they never backed up to talk about the why. Like, let's back up the train. Like, what does it even mean to be human? What does it mean to be a sexual being? Is there design? Is there intent? And so I think people just appreciate a thoughtful response, even if they disagree with your thoughtful response. We'll regularly have people come in off the street who are like, I disagree. I had a guy come up to me recently who has recently been baptized and started following Jesus. And he said, when I first came, I disagreed with 90% of what you said. I was like, wow, that's a lot, I disagreed with 90% of what he said. He's like, I really appreciated how thoughtful it was. And it got me thinking. And he was on this journey. And, and here he is now. He's baptized into the way of Jesus and following Jesus. And I just think for a lot of people, the secular story isn't working. And it's starting to break down. And I think there are cracks in the foundation all over the place. And I think the writing's a little bit on the wall. So I think there are more and more people that are interested in other stories to make sense of what it means to be human, even if they disagree or full on disagree. But if they're done in a way, it doesn't have to even be brilliant, but just that is at least a little bit thoughtful, that does a little bit of the back work to talk about the why behind whatever the problem or the issue is. I think that goes a lot farther than most people realize.
Yeah, I think you're right. Such a good picture to paint of the walls and the foundation cracking of people who've been pursuing answers that are coming to dead ends. And the point to the church is, if we don't have anything to offer when people start asking those big questions again because we've tried to keep up, we've lost our role, we've lost our way, and so it's important to remain faithful. In closing, for those, you were describing earlier, like and it reminds me of James K.A. Smith's work on.
Yeah, love his work.
Yeah, you are what you love. It feels like there's a theme here that people are starting to understand idolatry and how much, especially in a Western setting, it's easy to make idols out of most anything and replace God with that idol. And I know for me, I was deeply convicted several years ago. Andy Crouch and Tim Keller, we had a whole Q session where we were talking about this, and Andy was, for one of the first times, sharing about what idols do. And I remember how convicting it was, because it said, look, when you create an idol, it always promises more than it could ever deliver. So it overpromises, completely underdelivers. It causes you to sacrifice your children. When you think about that, I mean, it's a gut check when you hear that, to go, look, when I start pursuing an idol, I start putting something in the place of God. I start making that where I'm going to get the deepest of fulfillment and pleasure and pursuit of desire. It ultimately means you're going to sacrifice in some way your children. That's a gut check that makes you go, man, where am I doing that in my life? And I need to take account of that for any people listening who are parents. But tell me this, for those who are stuck in that, they're like, man, I'm hearing this for the first time. I think I've probably had a poor view of God. It's not the kind of God you just described, because I do see God as angry or judgmental or never happy with me, or all of the different things we can come up with that hold us kind of victim and constrained from the freedom God wants for us. How is it that they can kind of hit reboot on that? Because so much of life, and narratives have been built around a vision of God. So talk a little bit about what that person can do to say, hey, I want to refresh that. I want to think a little differently about how I viewed God. Like, where would you tell them to go? How would they start that process?
Yeah, I think that it's pretty simple, honestly. I would just say one or two things. The main one is, I would just say, root yourself in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and let Jesus' view of God shape your own view of God, and let Jesus himself become for you the embodiment of who God is and who God is not. And so I think that looks like two things. One, it looks like just reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the four first-century biographies of Jesus of Nazareth, over and over and over and over again. Read them, memorize them, think on them, podcast them, read about them. Like, just immerse your mind and imagination and heart and life in the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which will cover Jesus' life, his view of God, all of his teachings, his view of what it means to be human. And then the second thing, when you're ready, is just start to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. The practice. Jesus ordered and organized his life around a set of practices. Silence and what the church has come to call spiritual disciplines: silence and solitude, prayer, community. Regularly, he would share a meal with the same group of people. Sabbath, synagogue worship for him, or for us, Sunday worship. He just organized and ordered his life around this set of practices. And I think that's what we've forgotten in the West. Somehow the way of Jesus became the religion of Christianity. And we forgot that the way of Jesus isn't just a set of ideas, or what we call theology. And it's not just a list of do's and don'ts, or what we call ethics. It is that, but it's more than that. It's also it's a lifestyle. And it's a practice. Like, early followers of Jesus would write about practicing. In fact, it was called the way of Jesus. Before the church was even called the church, it was called the way, because it was a way of life. It was a whole new way to be human. And I think that's so compelling, because, as you said, we're now dealing with the first adult generation that is the byproduct of the sexual revolution and the breakdown of the family. And what we see in our church is all sorts of people that have master's degrees from Brown or Stanford that are making $100,000 a year as a design exec or whatever in Portland, and who are just emotionally unhealthy, don't have a relationship with their father, hurt by mom, can't manage their own sexuality, or like, it's just shocking the amount of emotional and relational and spiritual dysfunction from highly educated, highly intelligent, highly successful, quote unquote, people. That's becoming the norm. And so I think more and more the actual lifestyle of Jesus is becoming so compelling. Like, one of the things that I get asked most about from my non-believing friends is Sabbath and community. So wait, you have a meal every single week with the same 20 people, and you've been doing it for how long? And you have a whole day a week where you turn off your phone and you just eat and pray and sleep and enjoy your family, and wait, what? And this is so compelling. So I think, I just say immerse yourself in the four Gospels, and when you're ready, start to adopt the practices of Jesus and go from there.
That's so good. Well, John Mark, we just appreciate you around here at Q, and I'm so glad so many of our audience got to be introduced to you today. So thank you.
Oh, it's an honor. Thanks for having me on.
Well, this has been a challenging conversation personally, as well as just for, I think, all of us, because it's asking these deep questions we don't often take time to reflect on and just pause to consider some of the kind of the junk that maybe we bring into the relationship we have with God, and the things we put on Him and the way that we perceive Him and how much our own identity is shaping that. And so I just want to encourage you, like, if this has stimulated some thinking in your own mind, maybe it's brought up some of your own wounds, old memories, things that you realize you've kind of placed into this relationship with God, but maybe they were never meant to be in the middle of this conversation, that you would just take the time. Don't get so busy. Don't get wrapped up in the next thing you have to do, but just take a moment and ask God to reveal that to you, to let the Holy Spirit move in such a way that convicts you and allows you to see God maybe in a new way, in a fresh way. Maybe go all the way back to Exodus yourself and just take time meditating on these scriptures and considering, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your relationship with Him? And in a great way, just start afresh, start anew, experiencing all that God's meant for you to experience in your relationship with Him. So until next time, we'll be praying that you have a great week, that you feel not only inspired, encouraged, exhorted in the conversation we had today with John, and we'll look forward to our next conversation.